There are rooms in certain museums where the air itself feels different. Climate controlled, carefully sealed, kept at a precise temperature year-round, these vaults hold ancient objects that most people will never see up close. In the silent basement archives of our most treasured institutions, some of the oldest human memories in the world are stored in low, unassuming drawers. Fired clay tablets, barely larger than a paperback book. Some of them are chipped at the edges. Some are cracked across the middle. Some are missing entire sections, broken off somewhere between the moment they were buried and the moment a shovel found them again, thousands of years later. If you're listening as you drift towards sleep, this is exactly what this video is for. Pull the blanket a little closer, because what we're going to explore isn't legend in the loose, careless sense of that word. It's something older, stranger, and far more documented than most people realize. It's the account of a rebellion so significant, so fundamental to the way ancient peoples understood their own existence, that it was pressed into clay and copied across centuries, passed from one culture to the next, like a secret too important to lose. So, here's the question, just one of many that sits at the center of all of this. Do ancient Sumerian texts actually reveal why the Igigi rebelled against the Anunnaki gods? That question might sound mythological, and in one sense it is. But there's a physical artifact tied to it, a real object, sitting in a real archive, that carries at least part of the answer. And the fact that it survives at all is something of a minor miracle. Tablet BM 78941 is catalogued in the British Museum's collection of ancient Near Eastern materials. It forms one small fragment of what scholars call the Atrahasis Epic, a long, multi-tablet narrative composed in cuneiform script sometime around the early 2nd millennium BCE. The tablet itself is baked clay, the upper right quarter missing entirely. The remaining surface densely scored with wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the material before it hardened. The script is Old Babylonian cursive, meaning it carries the particular compressed, flowing quality of a trained hand working quickly, preserving something that someone thought was worth protecting. And what's really incredible is just how old this story actually is. The Atrahasis Epic predates the book of Genesis by hundreds of years, possibly more, and the oral traditions from which its scribes were recording go back further still, into a period so early that writing itself was new and fragile, not yet trusted to carry everything, not yet embedded in the daily rituals of administration and law. Whatever the people of early Mesopotamia believed about how the world came to be, and what role humans served within it, they believed it long before they had any practical way to write it down. What we have on those tablets is the crystallized edge of something much older. Scholars have spent generations piecing these ancient texts together, matching fragments from different sites, cross-referencing parallel passages, arguing about how to read damaged sections where the cuneiform is worn, or missing entirely. That same work continues today. And what keeps this particular text intriguing is that this isn't just a flood story, though the flood is in there, echoing forward into later traditions in ways that are hard to miss. But perhaps the deeper mystery is something else entirely, a divine dispute between the gods, and this is not meant to be taken in a metaphorical or abstract sense. The Atrahasis Epic literally records a breakdown in the established division of cosmic order, as it was seen at the time. It records grievances, confrontation, institutional panic, and a negotiated solution that changed the very nature of the entire world. If you strip away the divine names and the supernatural framing, what you are looking at is something that reads remarkably like a documented account of organized workers reaching a breaking point, walking off the job, and forcing those above them to find another way. And that solution, that negotiated answer to the uprising, is where things become genuinely extraordinary. Because the resolution these ancient texts describe isn't a reassignment of duties or a reduction in workload, it came in the creation of an entirely new kind of being, a being fashioned from dark clay and divine blood, built to carry the labor that could no longer be sustained by those originally assigned to it. A being whose existence was, according to these texts, the direct consequence of this rebellion, which raises the question, who were these mysterious semi-divine lords of deep antiquity, and what pushed them to step outside the established cosmic order? To understand that, we have to go back, not just to the beginning of the story, but to the beginning of the world as these ancient scribes understood it. The Igigi occupy a peculiar position in the study of ancient Mesopotamian religion. They are, as a scholarly subject, an enduring curiosity. They appear across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions, always as a group, almost never as individuals. Unlike the Anunnaki, who have specific names, temples, personalities, identities, and entire literary traditions built around their specific stories, the Igigi are defined almost entirely by their mere function. They are workers. They are the ones who dug, and they are numbered in the texts at 600, an enormous collective presence that somehow remains almost entirely anonymous. But even that anonymity is in itself meaningful, because the older mythological traditions place the Igigi within a layered picture of cosmic ancestry. At the beginning of everything, long before the Anunnaki gods themselves, there were older and much slower forces. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology describes primordial beings born from the very first mingling of the primordial salt waters of Tiamat and the sweet fresh water of Apsu. Among the earliest offspring of that primordial union were beings called Lamu and Lahamu. They were vast in form, slow in motion, and described in ways that suggest something like the ocean floor itself becoming conscious. They settled gradually to the bottom of the first deep waters as foundational creatures of silt, their eternal presence forming the earliest solid ground beneath the primordial sea. The first bedrock the world would eventually rest on. There's something almost geological about this image, and it's deliberate. These early cosmological layers weren't describing personalities, they were describing forces in and of themselves, the most elemental forces of nature, dense, passive, barely individuated powers that had existed so long that they had become indistinguishable from the matter around them. From those ancient ancestors, through a long succession of divine generations, came the Anunnaki, the bright and powerful gods who would eventually organize the world into something more recognizable. Chief among them were Anu the sky, Enlil the wind, and Enki embodying the deep waters and esoteric wisdom. These were not slow, elementary beings anymore. They were active, distinct, and deeply interested in the arrangement of the world around them. And therein lay the problem with the older generation. The ancient titans, the ones who had ruled the early universe with a kind of massive, immovable weight, were content to remain in darkness. They resisted change and had no interest in the kinds of organization and structure that the younger gods found essential. The Anunnaki eventually overthrew them, pushing those older forces aside in what the texts frame as a necessary cosmic reorganization, clearing the way for something new. But that act of rebellion, that overthrowing of the old order, inevitably came with a cost, because even once you have displaced the old guard and claimed dominion over the earth, someone still has to manage it. With Anu maintaining order from the highest heavenly realms, Enlil commanding the powerful winds and storms which swept over the earth, and Enki presiding over its underground oceans. These high gods could not simultaneously maintain the vast architecture of the cosmos and also get into the ground themselves to do the physical work required to reshape the world's surface. The hierarchy that made their authority possible also separated them from the labor that kept everything functioning. So the burden fell to the younger and lower-ranking gods, known as the Igigi. And before we go further, it's worth pausing on something that matters, to better understand what comes next. Because when mankind stepped into the picture ages later, those ancient eastern territories would later develop formal systems of what historians call corvée labor, compulsory work extracted from a population by a state or ruling institution as a form of civic obligation. You see it in the massive construction projects of early Mesopotamian city-states, where large groups of workers were organized by temple administrators to dig canals, raise walls, and maintain the infrastructure on which those cities depended. This wasn't voluntary. It was built into the structure of how their society understood itself. But here's what's interesting. The Atrahasis text suggests that this concept of inherent responsibility, of labor as an inescapable condition assigned by one's position in the order of things, didn't originate as a human institution. The Sumerians appear to have understood it as something much older, a cosmic reality. The idea that the younger pantheon, the Igigi, simply inherited the physical work of the world the moment the Anunnaki rose to power, reflects a worldview where labor isn't incidental. It's structural. It's built into the hierarchy itself, and the world they were assigned to work on was not a gentle one. Picture southern Mesopotamia before the first mud brick temples had been raised, before the first canals had been mapped by human administrators, before anything recognizable as a city existed on those flat plains. What lay between the borders of their horizons was a raw and relentless terrain, a low marshy expanse, cut through with seasonal flood channels, dense with reed growth in the wet months and cracked with heat in the dry ones. The land was not farmable without intervention. The water did not go where it was needed without being told where to go. The rivers flooded unpredictably, depositing new silt in one area while starving another of moisture entirely. To make anything grow there, you first had to reshape the land itself. You had to dig. You had to cut channels through the hard-packed earth, opening paths for water to follow. You had to move enormous quantities of material by hand over long distances without the benefit of wheels or iron tools or any of the machinery that later generations would come to rely on. This was the work that the ancient texts describe as the Igigi's sole responsibility. And they didn't just dig irrigation channels. The scribes who recorded these accounts explicitly credit the Igigi with carving the actual riverbeds of the Tigris and the Euphrates themselves, digging the very watercourses that gave the land its shape and character. They extracted raw minerals from the deep underground. They managed the earthly infrastructure that the Anunnaki required to be maintained, while they administered the larger order of the universe above. This was foundational labor in every sense of the phrase. Without it, the cosmic system didn't function. Without it, the gardens that fed the gods couldn't exist, and the world as the Anunnaki intended it simply wasn't possible. As one would expect from such a tremendous undertaking, the Igigi fulfilled this work for a very long time. The Atrahasis texts measure the duration in a specific unit, a sar. In the Mesopotamian numerical system, a sar is 60 squared, meaning 3,600, the base unit of their incredibly advanced sexagesimal counting system. The texts record that the Igigi labored for 40 sar before the rebellion finally broke out. That number, 40 multiplied by 3,600, carries the weight of what scholars understand as an incomprehensibly long period of time. It signals duration beyond the scale of ordinary experience, an amount of time so large that it bends the human imagination. Just think about what that wait would feel like. Not in years or decades, but in the context of daily existence. The same task, repeated across an expanse of time that has no visible end. The mud that doesn't stay where you put it, because the floods come again. The channels that silt over every so often. The ground that constantly shifts. The work that undoes itself and begins again and again. There is no finalized goal possible in this system, no moment of completion where the labor is declared finished and the workers are released. The task is ongoing, because the earth is ongoing, because the cosmic order that depends on this maintenance never stops requiring it. What the Atrahasis Epic captures, in the precise and careful language of its cuneiform lines, is the moment that wait became too much, the moment when the silent endurance of 600 anonymous gods finally reached its absolute limit, and something irreversible began. But to understand how they broke, and what happened next, we have to first stand with them in the darkness, in the soft sound of a tool striking earth, again and again, in the long, deep silence, just as the great fires first signified an impending shift in the grand design. There is a moment in the Atrahasis Epic where everything shifts, not gradually, not through debate or negotiation or any of the slow machinery of institutional change. It happened in the middle of the night, somewhere between midnight and the first grey suggestion of dawn, outside the walls of the Ekur, Enlil's great sacred residence in the ancient city of Nippur. The Sumerians called it the Mountain House, a fitting name for the dwelling of the god who ruled the air between earth and sky, who held the tablets of destiny and commanded the very hierarchy of the divine world. It's here, outside his sacred temple in that specific quiet hour, that the Igigi made their move. The records don't build slowly toward this moment. It arrives the way a crisis always does, suddenly, and after a very long time coming. The scribes who pressed those wedge-shaped marks into the clay were documenting what may be the oldest labor uprising in the written history of the world. And if you slow down and read carefully, you can feel the tension building in the lines long before the fire is lit. After all, it had been brought about by generations of extraordinary discipline. The Igigi had been laboring for around 450,000 years, by some accounts. That number carries weight in Mesopotamian literature, the way 4s often do in ancient archives, whether you're reading Sumerian clay tablets or much later Hebrew scripture. It signals not just duration, but a kind of threshold, the outer edge of what any being can be reasonably asked to endure. Over 400,000 years of digging watercourses and hauling heavy material, 400,000 years of reshaping rivers and heaping up mountains without rest, without recognition, without any suggestion that this arrangement would ever change on its own. And so they chose to change it themselves. In the deep silence of night, their endurance had finally reached its absolute limit. Here's what the texts describe. The Igigi gathered their tools, the heavy spades and picks that had defined their existence for as long as any of them could remember, and they set them on fire. That detail is worth sitting with. They didn't simply set down their instruments. They burned them. They placed their spades and picks directly into the flames, and they watched them go. There's something in that image that feels less like a labor dispute, and more like a declaration, a ritualistic show of permanent severance, as if to say, we will not carry these again, and whatever comes next, this version of things is finished. With their tools still burning, they surrounded Enlil's mountain house in the dark of night, forming a circle of gods who had built the very foundations of the world, and were now refusing to take another step, until someone listened. The institutional panic that followed was immediate. Nusku, who served as Enlil's vizier and closest advisor, heard the rising noise outside their temple walls, the sound of the surrounding gods, the heat of the fire, the silence underneath it. He woke Enlil, and here is one of the most quietly remarkable moments in all of ancient Sumerian literature. It is said that Enlil's face went pale, drained, the way tamarisk wood loses its color in certain lighting. This is the god who both created and commanded the air between heaven and earth. This is the figure at the apex of the divine order, the one whose very word shaped the cosmos. And he was afraid, not just concerned, actually afraid, because the system he depended on was standing outside his gates, waiting in the dark, and they were not going away. In that moment, he felt something that the scribes rarely attributed to the highest gods: vulnerability. A sudden and dizzying awareness that the hierarchies he had built, the order he had imposed across the cosmos, depended entirely on the consent of those he had positioned beneath him. The Igigi could have been dismissed as insignificant. Despite being immortal themselves, they held no titles. They attended no councils. They were merely the workers, the invisible machinery that kept creation running. But they were also 600 strong, unified in purpose, and standing outside his house with burning tools. Enlil understood, in that pale and drained moment, that power is not the same as invulnerability. Authority without cooperation is merely the illusion of control. Enlil sent Nusku out to speak with the gathered Igigi, to ask who had organized this, to find the leader, the instigator, the name they could isolate and address. It's a familiar instinct, that impulse to personalize a collective action, to reduce it down to one responsible party. And the Igigi gave an answer that the texts record with a kind of quiet power. Every single one of us gods declare war, they said. The load is excessive, the work is too hard. There is no leader. And even if there was, there is no single name to be given. The rebellion didn't belong to any one of them. It belonged to all of them equally, and there was nothing Enlil could do with that. You can negotiate with a representative. You can punish a ringleader. You cannot punish 600 gods who have decided, unanimously, to simply stop. That collective solidarity is one of the things that makes this story genuinely strange to read, even now. The Igigi are largely anonymous throughout historical literature. We know only a handful of their individual names. As a group, they're defined by what they did, not by who they were. And in this moment, that anonymity becomes a kind of armor. Their strength comes precisely from the fact that no single figure speaks for them, that they answer with one voice, that their grievance cannot be narrowed into one person's complaint. They had built the rivers of Mesopotamia, they had shaped the mountains, and they had done all of it without their names being carved anywhere. The remnants of their memory left behind still preserve their actions, but erase their identity, which is perhaps the deepest irony of all. They had asked for nothing more than recognition. They had demanded only that the system acknowledge what they carried, and the answer the Divine Council would eventually give them was not acknowledgement, but replacement. Their work would be turned over entirely to creatures who would never even know the Igigi had come before them. The senior gods convened in council. Anu, the sky god, who held distant authority over the entire pantheon, being his children and descendants. Enlil, shaken and pale, with the noise still audible beyond his walls, and Enki, the god of wisdom and the deep waters, the one the traditions consistently present as the clearest thinker in any room. The question before the council was real and urgent. The Igigi were not simply inconvenienced, they were serious. They were prepared to wage war if their demands went unmet. This wasn't a negotiating posture. The Anunnaki had to reckon with the possibility that the beings who had done the fundamental work of creation could become their ultimate destroyers if pushed far enough. Enki listened, and then he said something that would determine the shape of everything that followed. "The petition is justified," he told the council. "Their labor is too heavy. What they're asking for is fair." It's a remarkable moment because Enki doesn't defend the system. He doesn't argue for order or hierarchy or the importance of maintaining divine authority. He simply acknowledges that the Igigi are right, and having acknowledged it, he begins to think about what to do instead. The assembled gods now had to confront something that the existing order had no clean answer for. The Igigi were not wrong about the conditions of their labor. Even Enlil seemed to understand this, if his pale face in the darkness meant anything at all. The question now was not really whether the complaint was legitimate. The question was, what could possibly be done about it? The framework of divine labor had been built on the assumption that the Igigi would continue doing what they had always done. There was no contingency for the moment they stopped. Even during this debate, it was Enki who spoke most clearly in the assembly. He was often the most practically minded of the senior gods, the one most willing to engage with the actual mechanics of a problem, rather than just its symbolic surface. And the solution Enki proposed was neither a punishment nor a negotiation. It was something far more consequential than either of those things. He proposed the creation of a substitute, which brings us to the part of the story, a part that many don't realize is in these texts at all. It is said that Enki descended, not upward, not into the councils of heaven, but down into the silent and subterranean realm he called his own. The Apsu, the deep freshwater that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, beneath everything visible and known. It was Enki's particular domain, the place where wisdom lived in peaceful silence, away from the noise and urgency and the politics of the divine court. And it was there, in that underground stillness, that he began working on something new, gathering the elements, thinking through the design, finalizing what the tablets describe as his blueprints for a living being made from the earth itself, from clay and water and something divine mixed in, a being capable of taking on the labor that the Igigi could no longer be asked to bear. The process was meticulous, and despite the urgency on the surface world, Enki did not rush his work. He shaped the clay carefully, considering every aspect of the new creation. What shape should it have? What capabilities would it need? How much consciousness should it possess? These were not simple questions. To make something too intelligent might breed the same resistance the Igigi had now demonstrated. To make it too simple might mean it lacked the capacity to do work that required thought and adaptation. Enki was designing not just a new species, but a solution to a fundamental problem of cosmic management. How do you build beings resilient and capable enough to serve, but docile enough not to rebel? Above him, the exhausted Igigi waited patiently outside. We aren't provided with any accounts of their thoughts during this period. But there's an image that the landscape of southern Mesopotamia makes easy to picture. Those flat reed-filled marshes where the rivers slow and spread, where the water catches whatever light remains in the sky and holds it for just a moment before the dark comes fully in. The Igigi had burned their tools. They had spoken their grievance. They had done the difficult and irreversible act of protesting. And now there was nothing left to do but wait, listening to the water move in the darkness, letting the quiet of the marshlands settle into muscles that had been working without rest for longer than most civilizations have even existed. That waiting is its own kind of detail, because this legend isn't simply a story about gods and labor. It's a record of what happens at the edge of a system's endurance, when the beings doing the foundational work decide that they've reached the limit of what they're willing to give. The Igigi didn't ask for power. They didn't demand Enlil's throne or a place at the table of the senior gods. They asked to be released from work that was destroying them. And the answer the cosmos gave them, the answer Enki was slowly assembling in the depths of the Apsu, was not a promotion or a renegotiation. It was a complete replacement. The Igigi lingering in the dark outside the mountain house, with their spades still smouldering somewhere behind them, had set something in motion that none of them could fully see yet. What Enki was working on in the Apsu, down in the deep and quiet water, was the beginning of something that would reshape the entire cosmos and change the course of history forever. Not because the first creations would be inherently grateful or obedient, but because they would have no memory of any other way. They would be born into servitude and know nothing else. They would ask no questions because they would lack the historical context to understand that they were living within a system designed specifically to direct their efforts to a single, dedicated task. The Igigi had burned their tools and demanded freedom, but the beings who would come after them would never be allowed to see the bigger picture well enough to know that their tools could be burned. In this moment, the records quietly morph from a labor dispute among gods into something much older and stranger. The rebellion had ended, and the Anunnaki, faced with the collapse of the entire cosmic order, had no real choice but to find another solution. What came next wasn't simply a peace agreement between divine factions. It was the invention of a new kind of being that would carry the weight the Igigi had set down. But to understand what that new being actually was in the Mesopotamian imagination, you have to understand something they viewed as foundational to their societies, something called the May. In the oldest translations, the Holy May is one of those concepts that resists a clean modern equivalent. The Sumerians understood it as the set of divine parameters that held the fabric of civilization together. Not laws exactly, not commandments, something closer to the underlying logic of the universe, the invisible structure that made cities function, that gave kingship its authority, and that allowed rituals to carry meaning. The May included things like truth, descent into the underworld, craftsmanship, music, scribal skill, and the art of governing. Each one was a cosmic principle as much as a practical function. Without the May operating correctly, the Sumerians believed the world would simply stop making sense. Order would dissolve. Society would come apart in ways that couldn't be repaired by any human hand. So when the gods discussed what to make of the Igigi crisis, the May was not in the background. It was the central concern. The question wasn't just who would do the digging. The question was how to keep the sacred parameters of existence in balance. The answer came in Enki's proposal. He was the god of wisdom and of deep water, but more than that, he was also a supreme lord of craft and archaic magic. His solution was precise: to create a being capable of terraforming and managing the earth, and to do it in a way that gave that being a genuine capacity to understand what the work required. Not a mindless body, not simply a creature of instinct, something more deliberate than that. Enki laid out his method with the kind of detail that suggests this was understood as a technical process of biological engineering, not a casual act. The ingredients were specific, the ritual was specific, and one element in particular sits at the center of the whole procedure, lingering in the heart of Sumerian mythology, in a way that the later texts return to again and again. A god would have to be sacrificed. And his name was Weila, or Geshtu in the oldest traditions. He wasn't a major figure. He wasn't a member of the Supreme Triad. He's described as a god who had the spark of intelligence. That word matters. The Akkadian term used in this context connects to something the priests called temu, an inner quality of mind that went far beyond simple awareness. Temu was the capacity to plan, to reason across time, to hold a complex idea together long enough to act on it. It was closer to what we might call a higher logic rather than raw sensation or emotion. And Weila, this relatively minor god chosen for sacrifice, was understood to possess it in a concentrated form. His sacrifice was the pivot on which the whole creation story turned. Because between the lines of those ancient inscriptions, it is heavily implied that it was Weila himself who had sparked the desire for outright rebellion among the lower class of Igigi deities. They may have had no defined leader, but it was he who had provided the strategic intelligence necessary to stage such an effective mutiny. And so, for these reasons, it was he who was chosen. His very life's essence would be utilized in this grand act of creation. Here, the ancient priests describe a fascinating ritual, Weila's blood being mixed into clay, and Ninhursag, the birth goddess, helps Enki to carefully shape the mixture in their own image. But his blood doesn't simply animate the clay the way water softens dry earth. In their beliefs, it transmitted something much more profound. Weila's temu passed through the blood into the body of the very first human, embedding a quality of mind that clay alone could never contain. What this meant to the scribes who recorded it, and to the communities who heard it recited, was that human intelligence wasn't accidental. It wasn't a feature that simply emerged from physical form. It was inherited deliberately from an immortal member of the Anunnaki gods themselves, and that god had been sacrificed specifically so the transfer could happen. The gravity of that idea is worth letting settle a moment, because it shapes everything we ever thought we knew about our origins, about our capabilities, about questions that have hovered unspoken, but always present throughout all of human history. The gods themselves didn't treat it as a gift in the generous sense. It was a necessity of our engineering. The intelligence mankind inherited was functional. It was intended to solve a specific problem. The Igigi had refused to maintain the canals, the river channels, the irrigation systems that kept the world itself alive. These were not simple tasks. Coordinating the excavation of a major canal system across a populated floodplain required the ability to plan sequences of work, to manage groups, to anticipate flooding seasons and adjust accordingly. It required exactly the kind of forward thinking that Weila's light represented. The May and the concept of temu connect here in a way the texts don't always make explicit, but seem to assume. The May held the parameters of civilization, while temu gave humans the mental capacity to operate within those parameters. Without the May, there was no structure for human activity to follow. Without temu, there was no one capable of following it. The two together made something the gods apparently couldn't otherwise replicate, or didn't need to. A being who could sustain the complex work of a functioning world without constant divine supervision at every step. That's a significant claim for a mythological tradition to make about humanity. It's worth noting that this isn't a story about humans being created weak and dependent. The whole premise requires that humans be capable enough to do what the Igigi could no longer be made to do. What that capacity looked like in practical terms was the management of advanced cities. The first capitals of ancient Sumeria were not simple places. They were layered systems of obligations, towering structures, fragile economies, seasonal labor for maintenance, accounting, legal formalities, and ritual cycles that organized time. All of it required people who could hold multiple timelines in their heads simultaneously, who could track what was owed and what was due, who could coordinate labor across a vast landscape rather than just within arm's reach. The Temu, in their mind's eye, was what made that all possible. It was the cognitive inheritance that allowed a human administrator to look at a swelling river and know, 3 seasons in advance, what the irrigation system would need. It was what allowed scribes to develop the art of writing, first as accounting, then as literature, because to them, writing itself was an ability meant for extending the holy May across time and distance, for holding complex plans in a form that outlasts any single mortal mind. The canals the Igigi had abandoned didn't dig themselves after humanity was created. The tablets are clear that humans took over this work, and the Atrahasis poem frames that transition as the resolution of the divine crisis. When it was done, when Ninhursag had helped shape them to perfection and ushered the first breath into their sleeping forms, the first 14 human beings opened their eyes to gaze upon a pristine earth. 7 men and 7 women. The very first, mankind had been successfully designed to be capable of carrying and sustaining the work the gods had found unendurable. Enlil would stand before the divine assembly and declare the yoke lifted. "I have done away with your heavy forced labor," the text records him saying. "I have imposed your drudgery on man and made restoration. The labor has been transferred, and the sacred workings of the holy May can continue operating in harmony." But underneath that orderly resolution lies the stranger concept, the idea that the whole structure of Mesopotamian civilization, the canals, the cities, the temple archives, the seasonal rituals, the towering ziggurats that would reach toward the sky, they were all understood to have originated by way of a deliberate act of cognitive engineering, a divine act of intervention by the Anunnaki gods themselves. The borders of the civilized world would not be maintained by human ambition or ingenuity alone. They were maintained and perpetually driven by something far older, something passed through bloodlines into the richest soils of the primordial earth, where a quality of intellect that originally belonged to the gods themselves was given, or perhaps installed, into the first human forms, so that the balance of the universe could remain in equilibrium. That understanding left a particular kind of mark on Mesopotamian beliefs, one that can be seen throughout every long thread of their incredibly rich lore. The accounts they left behind leave echoes of an idea that is hard to fully fathom, the idea that human intelligence wasn't naturally evolved, but that it carried within it a trace of something divine, something sacred. It shows up quietly in the way their culture talked about everything from wisdom to the weight of kingship to the sacred obligations of the scribe. The divine knowledge of the holy May would be intricately woven into every facet of their mortal lives, from the rich smell of cedar resin drifting through cool temple walls to simple daily chores. Its essence would bubble up from the Apsu to nourish them like a vital spring. And so, the gods' work was finished, their vision of a bountiful earthly paradise preserved, not with thunder, not with proclamation, but with something quieter, a slow settling the way a warm fire breathes down to embers after a long night. The dispute that had shaken the courts of heaven had finally resolved itself into something no one had quite anticipated, not punishment, not surrender, something closer to unanimous relief. The luminous halls where the heavenly assembly gathered that night were lit from within by a warmth that seemed to belong to the walls themselves. The Anunnaki took their seats, and the Igigi, for the first time in longer than memory could clearly reach, sat down beside them as something other than labourers. The beer was sweet. The wine moved steadily around long tables. There was no agenda, no further decree to issue, no channel left to dig, no measurement to take before the sun rose again. The gods drank deeply, and their hearts became elated. Not with triumph exactly, but with the particular lightness that comes when something that has been carried for a very long time is finally set down. Thousands of years of accumulated exhaustion, of cracked hands and weary limbs, and it all ended not with a war, but with a feast, with cups raised in halls that smelled of barley and cedar, with the low murmur of voices that now, at last, at peace. The Igigi drank joyously alongside supreme gods, and somewhere below them their new creations opened their newly formed eyes to gaze in wonder at the world around them. After the feast, the ancient sky settled over everything like a warm blanket laid gently across a sleeping world. The gods moved outward from the lit halls into the open air of the night, the darkness above them thick with stars, not the distant cold stars of a sky you're watching with detachment. The warm and familiar stars of a satisfying night when nothing more is required of you. Each god knew, without needing to say it, that the rivers would still be maintained, that the fields would still be worked, that the order of things would hold, guided by capable hands, hands shaped for exactly this purpose. And far below, in the flat, dark southern marshlands of ancient Sumer, the clay was waiting for them to define its shape. The mud-brick streets of the earliest cities were already lingering just over the horizon, waiting to be imagined, to be laid down one careful step at a time, by the people who would eventually dream them into being. The conditions for all that was to come were already in place. The soil of the river valley was deep and rich. The waters of the Apsu had grown still with tranquility, the surface darkening into something like a mirror, reflecting nothing but the silence and the star-speckled tapestry overhead. The underground chambers where the Agigi had uncovered precious ores were now quiet. The fires in those deep places had long since burned down, and the last of the heat was rising slowly through the earth to dissipate into the cool open air above. A comforting breeze returned to Nippur. It came from somewhere out across the wide plains, unhurried, carrying just enough coolness to soften the warmth of the evening. It moved along winding pathways between the temple precincts and down through the low-lying areas of the city, where the reeds grew thick along the water's edge. It passed through now empty spaces where ancient tools had been thrown down and left for the next caretakers. And then it continued outward, across the flat expanse of the southern plains, across the dark fields and the slow rivers and the unbuilt cities, across all the unmeasured distance of the ancient world. The plains of Sumer were very still. It was a world simply returning to its own natural rhythms, the water settling, the clay resting, the sky doing what it had always done, turning slowly overhead with its fixed and patient lights watching vigilantly from a distance. Whatever had been set in motion, whatever was to come from those long ages of immortal dedication and divine negotiation, it had passed through this period and come out the other side, into a cool, peaceful evening in the quiet plains, the unhurried darkness sinking gently down over everything that had just been created and everything that had not yet begun.